Well, I was born and I grew up in a middle-class, non-observant Jewish family in Brooklyn. And so my family or my parents, we observed the Jewish religious holidays. So my parents were not religious believers. They just had us observe these holidays so that we would be aware of our Jewish ethnic culture and our background. But when I reached around the age of 20, I felt a kind of emptiness in my life. Like it seemed like the only avenues open to me would be leading to some kind of secular middle-class existence, being satisfied with raising a family, having a job, being well-educated, earning sufficient money, to subsist quite contentedly. But I wasn't satisfied with that, and so I felt, well, for one thing, when I was in college, I began majoring in philosophy, which was part of a quest for a deeper understanding. And then as I went on exploring different philosophies, different spiritual systems, I came across some books on Buddhism. And this aroused my interest, and I was reading on what was available on Buddhism during this period. This was the time about 1965, 1966, when the books that were primarily available were those by the Japanese Zen scholar D.T. Suzuki and his Anglo-American interpreter Alan Watts. Then in 1966, I went to graduate school in California, to Claremont Graduate School. And during the first year that I was there, the second semester of the first year, a Buddhist monk from Vietnam came to study at Claremont Graduate School, and he came to live in the same residence hall where I was living. And so I took that as an opportunity to learn something firsthand about Buddhism from somebody who was a living representative of the tradition. And so before long, I would be making regular visits to his room in the residence hall and getting instructions in Buddhism from him, and my first instruction in the practice of meditation. And then we wound up going off campus and living together for 2.5 years in a little house. And I actually took ordination under him as a novice within the Vietnamese Buddhist system. But then in 1970, after he completed his studies, he returned to Vietnam, and I still had another 1.5 years to go to complete my degree. And so during that period where I was still continuing to work on my dissertation, I met several Buddhist monks from Sri Lanka who were traveling through Southern California. And this established a kind of connection between myself and Sri Lanka. And so when I finished my graduate studies, I already knew that I wanted to become a monk, to become fully ordained as a monk. So within a short time, I sort of wrapped up my worldly affairs, and then I left for Sri Lanka, and I became reordained in the Sri Lankan Theravada tradition. For me, it came pretty strongly and intuitively, the sense that I wanted to become a monk. And in my case, there was no inner struggle. Should I? Shouldn't I? Can I do it? Do I really want to do it? It seemed almost as though the play of or destiny was sort of pulling the strings behind the scenes. In that I already had this strong interest in Buddhism. I had made several attempts to do meditation on my own, but without any guidance, I didn't really know how to go about it. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, a Buddhist monk comes from the other side of the world in 1967 to live in the same building where I'm living. What happens with a lot of people, well, let's say that there are two approaches to entering monastic life that I found. One is that of people who get intuitively a very quick sense, I want to become a monk, and as soon as the opportunity opens up, they seek out the opportunity to take ordination. And this doesn't, even though they might initially have that strong intuitive sense, I want to become a monk, I'm fit for the monastic life, often they don't have the sustaining power. What I witnessed during my years in Sri Lanka showed that for the Westerners who become Buddhists, ordained as Buddhist monks, there's an extremely high dropout rate. During my time in Sri Lanka, there must have been maybe close to 100 Westerners who came through and took ordination. And there would be, interestingly, waves coming from different countries, usually European countries. In one wave, there would be like, we call it the German invasion. Another period, there would be like a wave of Frenchmen coming and taking ordination. Maybe this was the time when Yugoslavia was breaking up, a wave of Serbians who came and took ordination. Yeah, but a lot go through, take ordination, and then it could be after 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, even 10 years, then they leave to return to the lay life. Yeah, so I said one mode of entry is those who have that intuitive sense and act on it quickly. The other is that of those who prefer to proceed cautiously, to gradually establish closer connection with the Buddhist monastery, with Buddhist teachers, and then weigh the option of taking monastic ordination until it becomes something that's felt as compelling within them. And now, looking back in retrospect, I would recommend the second approach, even though I'm glad that I took the step that I did and taken. For those who are interested in ordination, I recommend going about it very carefully and cautiously, rather than just jumping into the water. I think that there are, since the monastery where I stay at is a predominantly Chinese monastery, so we don't see very many Westerners coming, let's say native-born Americans coming here to seek ordination. So we do have a few. There's actually one young man, he's an African-American man from Brooklyn, and he came here, the first time he came here, he was just 19 years old. He came for a meditation retreat, and then very soon after that, he asked to take ordination, and now he's been ordained a little more than 2 years. First, let me just go back a little bit and trace my own trajectory, because that will maybe shed some light on this question. Now, the time that I was becoming interested in Buddhism was also the late 1960s, and that was the time of the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement in the United States. So two big, very, very pressing social issues had come to the forefront of the American consciousness. And I was quite actively involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement, going on the marches, and in graduate school we would have a silent vigil every week against the war and distributing leaflets and in the shopping malls against the war. And so I felt a strong social calling, a calling of conscience to be actively engaged. But when I encountered Buddhism, then I came to understand at that time, at that particular juncture in my life, that the important thing for me to be doing was to be working on myself. I came to see it almost like a parting of the roads, or a divided road, one leading to more and more like social engagement, transformative action, outwardly transformative action, the other leading towards the development of a more spiritualized consciousness. And it was not only me that felt that way, but I noticed in the youth culture of that period, there seemed to be a division between two camps. One camp was that of those who were engaged in various socially transformative projects, like this, again, the civil rights movement and anti-war movement, with Students for a Democratic Society, there was SNCC, and SANE, the Organization for a Sane Nuclear Policy. Okay, so a lot of young people were drawn towards social activism. And then there was another group which was moving in the different direction, sort of exploring the Eastern religions, meditation, and also the use of psychedelic drugs as a means of transformation. And so that group was looking inwardly. Okay, so I felt myself drawn towards at that time, away from the socially engaged activist path towards the inward spiritual contemplative path. And pretty much that was the path that I pursued during my early years as a monk in Sri Lanka. But perhaps during the middle 1980s, I was appointed the editor for the Buddhist Publication Society in Sri Lanka. And so I had to, in that position, I had to write an editorial essay whenever we issued our newsletter. And so that sort of compelled me to look more widely out at the world and to see how the principles of the Buddha's teaching could be applied to address the monumental problems that are facing humanity today. And so that responsibility pushed me back into the track where I had to consider what are the overwhelming problems that are oppressing humanity today, and what does the Buddha's teaching have to offer as ways of addressing and rectifying those problems. And so with this, I call it a kind of widening of my consciousness, or expansion of my consciousness away from the inner domains back out into the world, and to see especially, well, in Sri Lanka itself, there had been an ongoing ethnic conflict, which was taking a lot of lives and enveloping the whole society. And out in the world, there was expanding, there was particularly the neoliberal free market economic theory, which was transforming the economies of countries and leading to widening gulfs between the rich and the poor. And the onset of, as we come into the 1990s, the onset of globalization, whereby corporations are gaining an immense amount of power and using their power, their grip on governments and policies to uproot and decimate whole communities of ordinary people who are just struggling to survive. And so I came to see that if our spirituality is really worth its salt, it has to do more than just help us dwell peacefully with a balanced mind within the world, but it also has to impel us to engage with the world, to try to directly confront, even to tackle and overcome those vested interests and powerful forces that are creating so much havoc and destruction around the world. And so as I came to see this need, I also came to see what I would call two possible movements in spirituality. One I call a movement going from an ascending movement, a movement which is going from our present condition of, call it ignorance, delusion, sin, bondage, suffering, misery, towards a transcendent reality, a transcendent dimension, a state of wisdom, peace, freedom, radiance, liberation, and so forth. So one movement in the spiritual life is that upward movement from the depths to the height, but corresponding to that and complementary to it, there is another movement which I call a descending movement of spirituality. And that is the movement going from the heights of freedom, the heights of wisdom, the heights of peace and bliss and equanimity, out of compassion, out of love, coming back through grace, a descending movement of grace, coming back down into the world in order to engage with the world and to uplift, transform, and liberate those who are held in bondage to the world. Okay, now, I think that model of an ascending movement, descending movement can apply to spirituality, or the major forms of spirituality throughout history, even going back, to ancient India, ancient China. But I think what becomes quite distinctive of our own period is the need with this descending movement, not merely to help individual people find greater peace, happiness, wisdom, and freedom in their personal lives, but also to be able to examine, to scrutinize the massive, oppressive, social, political, and economic structures that are responsible for so much harm and suffering, and that portend great danger for the future. And this, I would say, is perhaps a new element in descending spirituality, a movement which is made possible first by the fact that humanity has become more interconnected than ever before, and also by the fact that we have the instruments for instantaneous communication, which we didn't have in the past. Yeah, but I did want to come back to the question of mindfulness. Mm-hmm. And I've also, like you, I've been somewhat concerned by the way I see that the practice of mindfulness is being taken out of its original setting. You know, its original setting in Buddhism was part of the Eightfold Path, part of the path to spiritual liberation. And sort of the aim of that path is the removal of greed, hatred, and delusion. But now, just the practice of mindfulness is being taken out and being treated as a self-sufficient practice, even by corporations. That concerns me more than a little bit, quite a lot, I'd say. There's an article by the Slavonian philosopher Slavoj Žižek. I'm not sure about the pronunciation.
A cultural critic, Žižek.
Žižek. Okay, he wrote an article called Western Buddhism, which in some respects he misunderstands Buddhism, but he says that although Western Buddhism presents itself as the remedy against the stressful tension of capitalist dynamics, it actually functions as its perfect ideological supplement. And now I don't want to endorse that as a statement about Buddhism itself. The particular way, not only the mindfulness practice, but sometimes the way Buddhism itself is being appropriated by the Westerners, especially in the United States. You know, it's being treated, particularly the meditation practices, are being treated as a way to be able to live peacefully, happily, with equanimity amidst the frantic pace of modern life. You know, the kind of the ideal stress reduction program is Buddhist meditation. And I think on the one hand, this would be a misuse of the practice of Buddhist meditation. It's a misuse in that one is using it in order to, the way Žižek puts it, in order to be able to function efficiently and effectively within the dominant, corporate capitalist system.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, it would be an abuse of the original practice of Buddhist meditation. On the other hand, though, I think his statement indicates, or the way I would see it, is that it points to the need for Buddhism itself to transform its own understanding, or perhaps widen its own horizons. Because the way I understand it, Buddhism originally developed against the background of a culture and a social order very, very different from the one in which we live today. And so against that cultural background, the Buddha could take as the aim of his spiritual system, breaking the bonds that tie us to worldly existence, to the suffering of the world. And so the practices that he teaches are designed to do exactly that, by enabling one to develop insight into the deep defilements of greed, hatred, and delusion in the mind that bind us to the world, and thereby gain a transcendent liberation, a liberation which lies beyond and outside the world. But the way my own horizons of understanding have changed over the years, I now see that the kind of liberation or spiritual endeavor that is called for today is the endeavor to bring the deepest insights and highest values of the spiritual path into our involvement with the world, our engagement in the world, in order to, again, to transform the social, economic, and political structures that are responsible for the oppression of people, for destructive practices, and especially in the global context now, that are responsible for the changing climate and overexploitation of natural resources to the point where we're actually jeopardizing the future of human life, human civilization on Earth. And so even if one takes a traditional Buddhist practitioner in a monastery in Sri Lanka, Thailand, Taiwan, Tibet, wherever, who's practicing within the framework of a traditional understanding where mindfulness is exercising its original, proper, traditional function, I still am doubtful that is fully satisfactory for addressing the kind of spiritual and moral challenges that we are facing today. Perhaps I would say that I see it continuing along two tracks. One track is the track that was started by Buddhist Global Relief, and that is basically using we call it the instrument or the value of altruism and philanthropy to help poor, impoverished communities around the world. So, the way Buddhist Global Relief works is through raising funds here in the United States and then working with partner organizations particularly in other countries, but also in the United States. Mm-hmm. And we're also very happy to have the Reciprocity Foundation. That is a track of what we call altruism or humanitarianism. And I think that's extremely important because we have to work by changing people's attitudes at the personal and private level so that people come to see the value not only of acquiring and hoarding for themselves, not only establishing their own security, but also that they can see the beauty, the value of giving to others and of helping to make the world a better place for people who would otherwise have to live in dire, terrible misery. Okay, so one track that I'm following is to continue with Buddhist Global Relief. And, since I'm now 70 years old, I have my eyes open for and Kim, who's the executive director, is in her 60s. So we have our eyes open for younger people to come in to continue for the next generation. Mm-hmm. So that's one track. But also, I believe, as I've said several times, that simple altruism and humanitarianism is not enough because the problems that we're facing today are systemic. They come from systems which have been, in a sense, taken over, dominated by certain privileged elites who are using the system for their own advantage and at the same time pushing others down into situations of extreme difficulty, extreme hardship, so that we see, the imposition throughout the world of austerity programs, the rise in the numbers of unemployed people, underemployed people, and then there is the continued reliance upon fossil fuels as sources of energy, and the attempts by the fossil fuel corporations to undermine and to upset any attempts to transform the economy in the direction of a new model based on clean and renewable sources of energy. So I think one has to work not only at the level of individual or even organizational charity and altruism, but also at the level of seeking social and economic and political transformation, but as spiritual people guided by certain inalienable and perennial spiritual values. And I see all of these values as stemming from the recognition that every human being is, I call it, a center of subjectivity, a center of experience, which means that every human being is entitled to be able to live with dignity, to pursue that which gives their life value and meaning, and not to be reduced just to a cog or an instrument of production within some larger system of domination that benefits the few. I think many fronts are opening up in this area. For one thing, I think one of the factors which has been stimulating this development across the traditions is the encounter of the different faiths with each other. And so now, as our different faiths encounter each other, we all come to recognize that we share certain fundamental values. And that is what I would say the recognizing the ultimate value of the human being over and against the dominant value of money or finance. And so what we're trying to do collectively, both in our own within our own individual faiths and collectively amongst the different faiths, is to push for a wider recognition that what ultimately counts are people, human beings. Or to put it using the simple slogan, it's people and planet above profits. So how we're going to go about this at a practical level, I would say what's taking place within the different faith communities, well, that's actually been going on for quite a long time, is the emergence of more socially conscious people within each of the faith communities. This has been going on in Christianity for a very long time, beginning back in the 19th century with the social gospel, and then continuing in the late 20th century in South America with the liberation theology and the concern of the Christian churches with human rights, and black churches, the push in the 1960s for civil rights. But I think that's having now an impact on all of the major faiths, so that we're all trying to discover within our own resources what can be the sources of guidance and inspiration that can help us take effective action to transform the dominant structures in a healthier, more holistic direction. I think different people have different callings, different vocations. I don't want to sort of impose my particular trip on others. If somebody feels that they're called into a really deep, reclusive, contemplative practice, as a contemplative hermit, then I am not going to go to them and say, you should leave your hermitage, get out into the world. It could be that that is that person's particular path, and that will be the path as long as they keep the mind of loving kindness and the mind of compassion. As long as they keep that state of mind established in their heart in an invisible way, they can be having a beneficial impact on the world. So I don't want to interrupt them and to cut short their experiment with the hermetic life and push them out into the world. But what I would say is that my sense is that today, when we're facing so many crises of such great proportions, that it's not sufficient for a large number of people just to take a reclusive approach to the spiritual life. But if we're really going to bring spirituality to the next level in its evolution as a factor within human existence, it's necessary to bridge that gap that separates the spiritual from the mundane, the religious from the secular, and to take the deepest insights and the deepest qualities of the spiritual path and use them both to guide us in our own action in the world and also to help us fashion, to hammer out the kinds of ideals that we would like to see embodied within the world. In the year 2007, I was requested by a Buddhist magazine in the U.S., it's actually in Canada, called Buddha Dharma, to write an editorial essay. And so one thing that had been weighing on my mind was what I saw as the division between the crises that we are facing as a civilization and the emphasis in Buddhist practice on a kind of inner path of finding inner peace, greater inner wisdom and insight without much concern about what is taking place in the world. And so I had that essay published, and it was published with the title, A Challenge to Buddhists. Then a number of my friends and students read the essay and spoke to me about it and said that they feel that we have to do something to put the challenge of that essay into practice. And so we had some discussion, and then we decided to form this organization that we called Buddhist Global Relief. Then we wanted to find a more specific mission for the organization. And one of the problems that had been weighing on my mind through my readings on the internet as well as my past experience in Asia, was the problem of global hunger and malnutrition.
Mm-hmm.
And so we decided to make that problem of global hunger the specific mission of Buddhist Global Relief. And we started by finding partner organizations in other countries that were working in the same direction. And so we would form partnerships whereby they would design programs that would address hunger, and we would provide funding for those projects. And after a short time, we began to see also that one of the factors that is responsible for continued poverty and malnutrition is the subordinate status of girls and women in many traditional cultures. And so we saw that one of the most efficient ways for moving people out from poverty and malnutrition is to support the education of girls and the training of women. Asia and Africa, actually, most of the farmers cultivating on small-scale farms are women. A lot of our projects are designed to provide girls with the opportunity to stay in school, and some of them have now even going on to college and university. Girls
That's
from the
really
poorest
wonderful.
imaginable families. If anybody wants to find out more about Buddhist